Sarah Whitlock stood in her sun-baked yard, sweat and dust clinging to her skin, rifle steady on the man who'd once shared Sunday dinners, now ready to kill the wounded Apache hidden under her floorboards. "They'll call you a traitor for this, Sarah," Mason spat, eyes cold. His sneer said it all. She was a fool ready to die for someone she should have left. Betrayal worth every bullet he'd fire. Behind her, a faint voice broke the tension. The Apache rasped, "Why help me?" Sarah's eyes stayed on Mason. "Because someone should." When Mason's bullet cracked through the heat, Sarah didn't flinch. She fired first. When the smoke cleared, the Apache rose beside her, bleeding but unbroken. In that yard, Sarah knew loyalty. Stand your ground, even when the world wants you dead. Sarah Whitlock stood barefoot in her dusty ranch yard, the dry earth hot enough to sting her soles. The noon sun burned down without mercy, baking the ground into cracked clay that clung to her ankles like grit from an old wound. Her rifle stayed steady against her shoulder, barrel aimed squarely at the man who'd once knocked on her door for a cup of coffee and a warm fire. Mason, the settler leader. Neighbor turned predator, a man who now looked at her like she was standing on land he already owned. Mason sat tall in the saddle of his bay gelding, boots polished, hat brim low enough to shade the glint in his eyes. His lips curled into a smirk that might have passed for friendly once, before the lean times and the whispers turned neighbors into enemies. He tapped his fingers on the leather holster strapped to his hip, an idle, dangerous rhythm that Sarah's eyes tracked without blinking. The air between them pulsed with heat and things left unsaid. Just beyond Mason's shoulder, 4 of his riders waited in a loose crescent. Boys barely grown, rifles slung across their chests, eyes shifting between their leader and the lone woman they'd been sent to corner. They tried not to meet Sarah's stare. Good boys didn't shoot women, they'd been told. But the desert made good boys mean, and hunger made mean boys reckless. A breeze lifted the edge of Sarah's skirt, flapping the frayed hem against her calves. The cottonwood tree that marked the boundary between her yard and the sunburned pasture whispered in the wind, its dry leaves hissing like a snake in the brush. She felt the sweat slide down the back of her neck, caught in the collar of her faded blouse. She wondered, absurdly, if the Apache man lying under her floorboards could hear any of this, or if the cellar's cool dark was enough to drown out the thunder building in her chest. Mason's horse pawed at the dirt, ears flicking back and forth. He shifted in the saddle, leaning forward a hair, weight settling in his boots. The leather creaked. "Sarah Whitlock," he drawled, savoring her name like a joke told at her expense. "You look about ready to carve your name in the dust with that old piece." Sarah said nothing. She didn't trust her voice yet. The rifle's stock was warm against her cheek, the trigger cool under her calloused finger. She remembered her father's voice, not soft, never soft, telling her a Whitlock didn't run from a fight worth bleeding for. Mason clicked his tongue. "You know, once upon a time we were neighbors. Good ones too. Your Henry brought over fence wire when mine snapped in that storm. We shared a pie or two at the table. Now look at us." He spread his free hand wide like a showman revealing a cheap trick. The gesture didn't reach his eyes. Sarah studied him, noting the dust on his boots, the sweat darkening his shirt under the arms. He hadn't come from town. He'd come from somewhere meaner, a place where men drank hate and called it law. "They say you got a visitor," Mason went on, voice dropping low. "A savage, wounded, crawled up under your porch like a coyote with its leg in a trap. That true?" Sarah's jaw tightened until her teeth ached. The Apache had been dying in the wash. Arrow through the thigh, vultures already circling. She'd hauled him in when she should have left him. That's what these men believed. That's what this yard was about now, making her pay for choosing mercy over fear. She shifted her weight, planting her feet deeper in the dirt. The wind kicked up, swirling grit around her ankles. Mason's smirk faltered, just for a moment. He wasn't used to folks standing so still when the ground shook under them. One of the boys behind him coughed, a nervous, brittle sound that cracked the silence. Mason cocked his head, eyes narrowing like a snake tasting the air. "You think you're going to save him, Sarah? You think they'll come back for you, bring you beads and songs for your trouble?" A gust rattled the branches overhead. Sarah thought of the cellar hatch bolted shut, of the man beneath it whose breath rattled like dry corn husks in winter. She thought of her husband's grave out by the fence line, the stones half buried by wind and weeds, and how many nights she'd sat on the porch alone, shotgun in her lap, pretending the darkness was just a curtain she could close. She steadied her aim. "Mason," she said finally, her voice raw but clear, "you ride off this land, right now, or you find out what happens when you back a Whitlock into a corner." The smirk died on his lips. The hand drumming on his holster went still. For a breath, the whole yard froze. The wind, the flies, the shifting hooves, all waiting for the spark to drop. Sarah felt her heart slow, the rifle's weight becoming part of her bones. In the hush, she almost thought she heard the Apache's ragged breathing under the floor, as if reminding her this was already bigger than fences and grudges. This was a line she'd already crossed. Mason shifted in his saddle, eyes flicking to the boys behind him. He didn't answer, didn't have to. His hand slid lower, brushing metal. Sarah inhaled the dry desert air, the smell of sweat and old wood in the coming storm. She braced her heels in the dirt, and the yard waited to see who would flinch first. Sarah didn't hear them at first. The Apache warriors. The desert wind was too loud in her ears, filled with the shallow thunder of her heartbeat and the rustle of dry grass that danced around her ankles. It was the sudden, unnatural stillness that made her glance toward the tree line. The stand of pine beyond her cabin cast a long, ragged shadow across the back of her yard. A place she'd chopped firewood, buried old tools, and years ago wept where no one could see. Now it seemed alive, the branches shifting just enough to reveal shapes that hadn't been there a breath ago. They stepped out in silence, a dozen men moving with the kind of patience only the hunted ever learn. Feathers tied into their braids fluttered in the breeze, war paint dark against copper skin. Their rifles rested in calloused hands, tomahawks strapped tight against their hips, blades glinting like a promise that the talking part was over. Sarah could feel the air shift around her. She didn't lower her rifle, but her eyes flicked from Mason to the warriors fanning out behind him. They didn't shout, they didn't bark orders. They just kept walking until Mason's men were caught in a loose, shifting circle, a fence made of flesh and grit instead of wooden wire. One of Mason's boys, no older than 20 if that, let out a curse that barely made it past his dry lips. He turned in the saddle, eyes wide, looking for an opening that wasn't there. His horse snorted, sidestepping as if it knew the ring had closed. Mason's smirk was gone now. His eyes darted left, then right, calculating, but his shoulders stayed squared. He wanted Sarah to see he wasn't afraid. That mask cracked when a warrior, older than the rest, a necklace of bone and turquoise at his throat, stepped forward from the line. Sarah's breath caught. She'd seen the elder once before, years ago when traders and tribal families crossed through this valley in warmer seasons. He was a man who carried command without lifting his voice. A man who didn't threaten because he didn't need to. The elder's eyes found Sarah's rifle first, then dropped to the cabin behind her, reading the situation without a word. When his gaze returned to Mason, it was as if he looked straight through him, a hawk sizing up a coyote that had wandered too close to the nest. Mason cleared his throat. "You come for your wounded?" he called out, trying for swagger, but landing on something thinner, more brittle. He gestured at Sarah with his chin. "Ask her if she plans on handing him back." The elder didn't flinch. He didn't speak English for Mason's sake, and he didn't need to. One slow nod at Sarah, permission or a warning, she couldn't tell. Sarah's pulse thudded in her ears. She could almost feel the cellar door behind her. The weight of the man she'd hidden when any other settler would have left him to the coyotes. She wondered what the warriors thought of her now. If she was a fool, a threat, or something neither side would ever claim. One by one, the warriors settled into their places around Mason's men. No orders barked, no signal given. The ring closed tight enough that Mason's horse shifted restlessly, ears pinned. One of his boys glanced back at him, eyes wide, waiting for something, anything, to make this go away. Sarah watched Mason's jaw work, the way his fingers flexed on the reins. The sun hadn't moved in the sky, but the air felt cooler now, a breath of shadow behind her that made her stand straighter. For the first time that day, she felt less alone. The elder finally spoke, voice low and firm, the syllables sliding like stones over water. Sarah didn't catch the words, but their weight was clear enough. Stand down, or don't. But you're not leaving with blood you didn't earn. Mason spat into the dust. So this is how it is? He growled, his eyes snapping back to Sarah. You'd rather stand with them than your own? Sarah's rifle never wavered. Maybe my own stopped standing with me a long time ago, she said. The words hung there, heavy as the midday heat. The Apache warrior stood silent, breathing the same dry air she did. The circle held. And for the first time since the gun was lifted to her shoulder, Sarah knew she wasn't the only one who would stand her ground when the hammer fell. Sarah could feel every heartbeat pounding against the rifle stock pressed firm into her shoulder. Sweat traced a line through the dust on her cheek, gathering at her jaw before dropping to the dry earth beneath her bare feet. The sun felt hotter now, as if the sky itself was waiting for her to flinch. Mason hadn't moved much. He didn't need to. He sat high in the saddle, fingers tapping the worn leather of his holster like he was strumming a tune only he could hear. His eyes locked on hers, sharp and small beneath the brim of his battered hat. He'd been her neighbor once, a man who tipped his hat at her husband and brought whiskey to their porch when the windmill broke. But that man was long dead. Or maybe he'd never existed at all. Behind Mason, his boys shifted in their saddles, uneasy under the eyes of the Apache ringed around them. The warriors had come out of the trees like ghosts, war paint and feathers alive in the wind, and now they stood silent, rifles cradled, watching the moment stretch and crack like a dried riverbed. Sarah's mouth was dry. She drew in a breath, slow and steady, feeling grit scrape her tongue. Her finger tightened on the trigger, the metal cold against her skin. She remembered her father's words. You don't shoot out of anger. You shoot because you're done talking. Mason's horse snorted, shifting its weight. His eyes flicked to her rifle for a fraction of a second. Just enough. Sarah saw his fingers tense around the grip, the twitch of muscle that meant his mind had decided before his mouth ever did. Time felt like it folded in on itself. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to the stretch of space between her and Mason. A few paces of dirt and dust, the air vibrating with the promise of thunder. Somewhere deep under her floorboards, she swore she could still feel the Apache's ragged breathing, a reminder that this wasn't just about her anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Mason's thumb slipped the strap off his holster. The faint snap of leather was enough to break whatever stillness held the yard together. Sarah squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked hard against her shoulder, the blast echoing across the yard like a crack of lightning in an open field. For a heartbeat, she saw Mason's eyes widen, his pistol only halfway clear of the holster. Dust spiraled where the bullet tore a line through his coat, a red bloom spreading across his shoulder. His horse reared, hooves slamming back to earth as Mason grunted, the pain forcing him to clutch the saddle horn to keep from toppling. His boys scrambled, one dropping his rifle in the dirt, eyes flicking from Sarah to the Apache and back again. No one fired back. Not yet. The air held its breath. Sarah's arms shook, the echo of the shot ringing in her bones. She didn't lower the barrel. Mason glared at her, teeth bared in a half-snarl, half-smile that looked more like a curse. You shouldn't have done that, he hissed, voice thin with pain. Sarah's voice came out raw, steady. Go home, Mason, while you still can. Behind him, the Apache warriors shifted, the circle tightening without a word spoken. The sun beat down on Sarah's shoulders, drying the sweat to salt. She felt the weight of the rifle like an iron brand, her feet rooted deep in her patch of dry earth. The first shot was fired. The silence was broken, and whatever line had once kept her safe was gone for good. The crack of Sarah's rifle still echoed in her head as she backed toward the cabin, boots forgotten, heels grinding into the dust. She didn't dare turn her eyes from Mason and his boys, didn't trust that half-snarl on Mason's lips or the twitchy fear in the hands of boys too young to know when to drop their guns. She felt it before she heard it. The shift behind her, the floorboards creaking as someone pushed the trapdoor open. The Apache warrior had come up from the cellar, dragging himself on one arm, the other pressed tight to the bandage on his thigh. His chest glistened with sweat, skin streaked with dust and the dull brown of dried blood. For a heartbeat, she wished he'd stayed hidden, safe. But safety was a lie she couldn't afford to believe in anymore. Inside, the cabin smelled of old timber, sweat, and the faint acrid trace of spent gunpowder. Sunlight filtered through the cracks between the warped boards, sharp blades of light cutting across the shadows where Sarah and the Apache crouched low. She pressed her back to the wall, the rifle still warm in her hands, pulse hammering so hard she thought it might rattle her teeth. He settled beside her, back to her back, his breath ragged but steady enough. She felt the heat of him through her shirt, the tremor in his shoulders each time he shifted to keep weight off his bad leg. He'd lost blood, but the fire in his eyes, when he risked a glance over his shoulder to meet hers, said he wasn't done yet. Outside, Mason barked orders, voice strained but still sharp enough to make the boys tighten their grips. Hooves thudded in the dirt. The Apache warriors moved too, shadows sliding between the pines, the circle shifting closer. The cabin felt like a brittle shell, its battered planks the last line between them and the storm brewing on the other side. Sarah leaned forward, peering through a gap between the boards. She could see Mason's shoulder wrapped in a strip of cloth now, dark with fresh blood. He was furious, but beneath that rage she saw it, the crack of doubt, the sliver of fear. His boys were skittish, eyes wide as they scanned the tree line for the next shot. They'd come here certain they'd scare her into giving up the Apache, certain they'd walk away with a kill to brag about. Now they weren't sure of anything at all. She felt him shift behind her, the Apache's shoulder pressing into hers for a heartbeat. She twisted just enough to see him nod toward the window, the smallest signal that he was ready. She wanted to tell him not to move, to stay hidden like she should have left him in that creek bed. But the words turned to ash on her tongue. They were past saving each other the easy way. He murmured something in his own tongue, so low she caught only the shape of the word, a promise or a prayer she couldn't tell. But the way he braced his rifle, a battered old Winchester someone had left behind in trade, she guessed, told her more than any words could. If they came through that yard, he'd be the storm waiting for them. Sarah steadied her breath, pressing one eye to the crack. A rider moved near the fence line, one of Mason's boys, shoulders hunched, rifle wobbling like he wasn't sure who he was aiming for. She lined him up in her sights but didn't squeeze the trigger. Not yet. The Apache leaned back against her, warm and solid, and she felt the strange ache of trust settling between her shoulder blades. This man was supposed to be the enemy, the trespasser her neighbors whispered about at church, the ghost stories parents told their children to keep them close to home. Yet here he was, watching her back like a brother in arms. A gunshot cracked from the trees. Not hers, not his. The Apache warriors had closed in tighter. Mason's boy yelped, his horse spinning, the whole line splintering as one of the younger riders bolted for the ridge. Mason roared something Sarah couldn't make out, but the wind stole it before it reached her. She felt the Apache behind her shift again, and she turned her head just enough to see him. His face was a map of dirt and old bruises, eyes dark but clear now. No fever, no doubt. He met her stare, and in that look she saw no question of who she was to him now. Not the woman who dragged him out of the dirt like roadkill. Not just the settler who'd fed him broth while she kept her shotgun within reach. Now they were something else. Two souls pinned to the same scrap of dying ground, choosing to fight together because neither one would leave the other behind. Outside, the yard rang with shouting, the clatter of boots and the bark of the warriors closing their circle. Sarah felt her hands go still. No fear, just the weight of the rifle, the steady warmth of the man behind her, the brittle walls that stood between them and the world that wanted them gone. Side by side they would stand, or they wouldn't stand at all. The wind blew through the yard in soft, restless gusts, carrying with it the smell of gunpowder and blood. Smoke drifted from the smoldering wood pile where a stray shot had splintered the stacked logs. Empty shells glinted in the dirt like bits of tarnished brass confetti. A cruel joke scattered across the land Sarah had once called safe. She sat beneath the battered cottonwood, back pressed to the trunk, its bark rough against her torn blouse. Her left arm was wrapped in a strip of fabric ripped from the hem of her skirt, hastily tied, already seeping through with red. She could feel the shallow burn of the graze and the deeper ache in her bones, but there was no more room for pain. She was too hollow, too full of dust and adrenaline, and the echo of gunfire ringing in her ears. The Apache warrior crouched in front of her, his shadow stretched long by the late afternoon sun. He'd taken a bullet too, a crease along his ribs, the fresh bandage tied tight where Sarah's shaking hands had pressed cloth and hope against the wound. His hair clung to his forehead in damp strands, his skin painted with streaks of blood, sweat, and dust. But his eyes, they were steady, locked on her face like he was trying to memorize every line that hadn't already been carved by the day. Around them, the yard was littered with the aftermath. Mason's boys, the ones who hadn't run, had been forced to drop their rifles, backing away under the watchful eyes of the Apache warriors who had slipped back into the trees, shadows against the fading light. Mason himself was gone, slumped across his horse's saddle, dragging a trail of dust toward whatever dark hole he'd crawl into to nurse his wounds and his pride. Sarah knew she hadn't seen the last of him, but she didn't have the strength to think about what came next. Not yet. The warrior shifted closer. He reached out, his hand rough and warm against her dirt-smeared knuckles. He didn't speak. There was nothing left that needed saying. His thumb traced the edge of her wrist, feeling the pulse that still beat there, proof that she hadn't given everything to the earth just yet. Sarah let her head rest back against the cottonwood. She felt the old tree steady her when the world threatened to tilt. She stared up through the bare limbs, watched the last bits of daylight fracture through the tangled branches. There was no neat ending to this. No line they could draw between before and after. There was only this moment and the raw truth that they were both still breathing because neither one had left the other to die alone. Somewhere beyond the cabin, a coyote called, a high, lonely sound that carried across the flat land and settled in her chest like a promise she didn't know how to keep. The Apache warrior's grip tightened, his thumb pressing against the small cut at the base of her thumb. An anchor, a reminder that the worst of the storm had passed, but the road ahead would demand its own kind of fight. Sarah drew in a ragged breath, tasting dust and the ghost of smoke. She wanted to say something. Thank you, or I'm sorry, or maybe just I'm still here. But her throat was too dry, her words buried under all the things that had gone unsaid since the first shot cracked the silence wide open. She met his eyes instead, and in that long, unbroken look, she saw what they were now. Not savior and saved, not enemy and stranger, but two people bound together by the brutal grace of survival. No promises, no guarantees. Just the weight of what they'd done, and the thin, stubborn thread that said maybe, just maybe, they could find something worth carrying forward out of this wreckage. His fingers closed around hers fully then, their hands pressed between them like a pack forged from blood and dust. Sarah let her eyes close, the last rays of sun flickering through her lashes. She didn't know where they'd go next. She didn't know who would come for them tomorrow. But here, under the old cottonwood, her feet rooted in the dirt she'd chosen to stand on, she knew this much. They hadn't survived this to crawl back to fear. Together they would stand, side by side, or not at all. Long after the smoke cleared from that battered yard, one truth still echoes. Sometimes standing your ground has nothing to do with fences or bullets, and everything to do with refusing to let fear decide who you stand beside. In our modern world, it's easy to think we're nothing like Sarah and the wounded Apache warrior. Yet we, too, draw invisible lines around our homes, our beliefs, our neighbors. We tell ourselves some folks aren't worth saving, because it's simpler to stand back than to stand up. But maybe courage today looks like lending a hand when you're told to turn your back. Maybe loyalty is sitting shoulder to shoulder with someone the world calls other, and in protecting the humanity you share when it would be easier to stay silent. What about you? Would you have risked everything the way Sarah did, or walked away to keep your place in a world that never truly protected you to begin with? Let's talk about it in the comments below. Tell us, where do you draw your line between caution and compassion? How does this old frontier lesson speak to the fences we build today, in our towns, our politics, even our families? Your thoughts might help someone else stand their ground with a little more grace tomorrow. Thank you for riding through this story with us. If you found something true in these dusty pages, a bit of grit, hope, or quiet strength, please hit that like button and share it with someone you trust. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next tale where the wild frontier teaches us something timeless about who we are and who we still can be.